Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, The Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World, by Dexter Roberts. Narrated by Joe Barrett. Key people in the book: Barshevsky, Charlene, former U.S. Trade Representative. Barshevsky helped negotiate China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. Deng Xiaoping, 1904 to 1997. Long a key member of Mao Zedong's inner circle, Deng was later purged twice by Mao before launching reform and opening of the Chinese economy in late 1978, following Mao's death in 1976. Often called China's paramount leader. Dong Xiangzhu, elderly farmer woman in Empty Nest village of Shongshu-le, Hubei. Feng Hongbao, chairman of Midea, China's largest white goods appliance maker. Feng's company acquired German robot maker KUKA in 2016. Fei Xiaotung, 1910 to 2005, prominent anthropologist and sociologist. Fei was an early advocate for rural land reform and establishing grassroots democracy in the Chinese countryside. After being purged during the anti-rightist movement of 1957, Fei spent 20 years out of academia, at one point cleaning toilets for a living. Feng Shengya, president of Guangzhou Automobile Group Company. Feng's company is branching into new energy vehicles and is a large recipient of government Made in China 2025 funds. Gua Terry, founder of Foxconn, Apple's largest supplier. Gu Andy, Midea deputy CEO who oversaw the acquisition of KUKA. Gu originally studied demography at Cornell University. Han Dongfang, prominent worker leader during the Tiananmen protests of 1989. Thrown in jail in China for a time after the crackdown, Han now runs a labor advocacy group from Hong Kong. Hongxiu Chuan, 1814 to 1864, leader of the millenarian Taiping Rebellion that seized control of much of southern China from 1850 to 1864. Hung was a utopian who believed in radical land reform and claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Hu Jintao, 1942, China's top leader from 2002 to 2012, who launched the new socialist countryside policy in 2005 in an effort to improve rural health care and education. Jiang Zemin, 1926, China's top leader from 1989 to 2002. Jiang rose through the party ranks, mainly while based in Shanghai. In 2000, Jiang launched the sweeping Develop the West plan to address the growing regional gap in China. Lai Ruoyu, 1910 to 1958, head of the government-run All-China Federation of Trade Unions during huge Shanghai labor protests in 1957. Lai, a former soldier, broke with the official line that blamed workers for their low-class consciousness and instead criticized the unions for not aiding workers. He was purged by the party and died of liver cancer in 1958. Li Di, founder of a small labor consultancy in Guangzhou. Li's company consults for global brands and retailers operating in China. Lenin Vladimir I, 1870 to 1924, Russian revolutionary leader and Bolshevik theorist. Li Keqiang, China's premier from 2012 to the present. Li has pushed for more rapid urbanization in China. The leader, who comes from the interior province of Anhui, has also championed a policy of encouraging mass entrepreneurship and innovation, which aims to move China to a more sustainable model of growth. Lin Zixu, 1785 to 1850, Qing Dynasty scholar and official known from youth as unusually brilliant. Lin advocated for the revitalization of traditional Chinese thought. Posted in Guangdong as the imperial commissioner in 1829, he is heralded in China today for fighting to stop the opium trade. Liu Ke, gray-haired senior aide who is liked by many Chinese intellectuals. He is a proponent of the automation of Chinese factories. Liu has served as Xi Jinping's top trade negotiator during the trade war with the United States. Lo Darin, a Taiwanese businessman based in Dongguan, Guangdong, for more than 20 years, formerly served as the chairman of the Taiwan Businessmen Association. Lo once ran a bicycle helmet factory in Superior, Montana. Ma, Jack, founder of Alibaba, China's largest e-commerce company. Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976, communist revolutionary and founder of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Meng Han, a 52-year-old former hospital guard turned labor activist who worked for Jiang Feiyang in Panyu, Guangdong. Meng was sentenced to 21 months in jail in late 2016 for disturbing public order. Miao Wei, former president of Dongfeng Motor Company. Miao is now a key official in China's technology strategy. Reuter, Till, KUKA's former CEO, who previously worked as an investment banker for many years. Reuter is pushed out of management by senior Chinese executives after the German robot maker is acquired by Medea. Stalin, Joseph, 1878 to 1953, leader of the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s to 1953. Wang Can, professor of industrial relations in Beijing. Wang Mang, 45 BC to AD 23, the only emperor of China's Qin dynasty. Wang introduced radical land reform during his reign. He was killed by rebels who rose up to end his rule. Wang Yang, while serving as Guangdong Provincial Party Secretary from 2007 to 2012, Wang advocated a policy of adding robots and technology to factories called emptying the cage and changing the bird. Now a senior official in Beijing. Wen Jiabao, China's premier from 2002 to 2012. While his family is known to be spectacularly corrupt, Wen launched measures to try to alleviate rural poverty, including by ending the agricultural tax in 2006. Wu Louis, former Apple executive, now serves as special assistant to Foxconn's Terry Gua. Wu Guizhou, former migrant worker. He became a labor activist in Shenzhen after being jailed for a year for participating in a strike in a furniture factory. Xi Jinping took over as top leader of China in 2012 and quickly moved to amass sweeping power and reassert the role of the Communist Party across politics, the economy, and society. Jiang Feiyang, early labor activist from southern China. Zhang Zhiru, prominent labor activist in Shenzhen, who has had to move his office and home repeatedly due to police harassment. Zhu Rongji, Chinese premier from 1998 to 2002. Zhu pushed reforms through the Chinese economy, including overseeing massive state enterprise reform and China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. The Moas from Binghuacun. Mo Bo-chen, a local party official. He hopes to see Binghuacun become a tourism destination rather than end up an empty nest village. Mo Mei-chuan, a cousin of Rubo's, once a shy factory worker in Dongguan, she eventually returns to Guizhou to start a family. Mo Rubo, a charismatic kid who dropped out of middle school. He worked in a succession of factories around China before finally starting his own business selling sports clothing. Rubo opted to stay in Dongguan, not far from one of the first factories he worked in. Mo Ruchuan, a one-time factory worker, he is now a serial entrepreneur who has never become the big success he aspires to be. Ruchuan thinks he's finally going to make it by capitalizing on a rejuvenated Binghuacun that draws vacationers. Mo Ruji, the eldest brother of Ruchuan and Rushun. He works as an official in a township not far from Binghuacun. Mo Ruxian, the father of Mei Chuan, who never leaves Binghuacun. Mo Rushuan, an ambitious local official. Rushuan has risen through the party ranks and now is a manager in a showcase economic zone near Guizhou's capital, Guiyang. Mo Wangqing, a migrant worker returning to Binghuacun. Wangqing is now running a fish farm in the village that aims to cater to tourists. Mo Wenke, the longtime party chief of Binghuacun, who hoped foreign investment would transform his village. He is now retired and lives nearby. Mo Wenzhe, one of the first to venture out of Binghuacun. He worked as a cook in a Dongguan factory. Wenzhe is now a manager in a lumber factory in the neighboring province of Guangxi. Mo Yukai, a relative of Rubois and Meichuan's. Yukai hates working in the city and hopes to someday return to the village. Attachment to the soil is one of the characteristics of rural society. It is normal for farmers to settle in one spot for generations. It would be abnormal for them to migrate. Fei Xiaotung, From the Soil, The Foundations of Chinese Society. Introduction. When I arrived to live and work as a journalist in Beijing in early 1995, Deng Xiaoping, China's once paramount leader, then retired, and reliably reported an ailing health, was still widely discussed by academics and business people, cadres, and average Chinese folks alike. Years earlier, he had already given up his last formal position as head of the military forces, and his only remaining title was head of the China Bridge Association. He had been an avid player. But despite his precarious physical state, Deng's influence over everything from top party promotions to economic policy-making was still hotly debated. Just hours after getting off the plane from New York City and emerging into the cold, dry January evening of Beijing, I listened as two foreign journalists discussed their plans to write obituaries for the tough, chain-smoking Sichuan native. As had happened before, rumors of his imminent demise had swept the capital. They would flare up every few months, sparking similar conversations, interspersed with more speculation about whether he was still strong enough to wield power from behind the scenes, until he died, just over 2 years later, at the age of 92. We were sitting in a restaurant serving Mao Jiaocai, or Mao family dishes. Mao Zedong was born in the province of Hunan, next to Deng's Sichuan, both places known for peppery food and producing national leaders. The pungent smell of the coal briquettes then still burned for heat was sharp in the night air, as an American reporter chided her boyfriend, an Australian reporter, for not having started writing his obituary. Whenever Deng did die, any self-respecting journalist would have to be ready to push the send button on an expansive piece looking at the legacy of the leader who, more than any other, was credited with moving China away from its autocratic past and into the modern world. And that obituary inevitably would focus on Deng's seminal role in launching economic reforms. In carrying out what Deng called Geige Kaifeng, or reform and opening, the paramount leader had taken a decisive step away from Mao's radical egalitarianism and set China and its people on a path toward today, a country with a high-speed railway network that accounts for 2/3 of the world's total, cities with craning skyscrapers and roads jammed with new cars, while below the ground ever more intricate webs of subway networks expand, a growing power in artificial intelligence and the world's second-largest producer of patents, and a country behind only the United States in producing billionaires with an ever more assertive leadership. At least two policies closely associated with Deng had been key. The first was ending the Mao-era communes and allowing China's hundreds of millions of farmers to begin to till their own agricultural plots or leave the land and work in manufacturing. The second was welcoming foreign investors, at first in the newly created special economic zones in Shenzhen, Xiamen, and other coastal cities, while at the same time encouraging the growth of private business. The story of farmers abandoning the communes in particular has become central to the official narrative of China today. In it, we are told, the pragmatic nature of the Chinese Communist Party shines. It shows how top officials were capable of accepting crucial changes when necessary, even while maintaining their unassailable ruling position, much the way they allowed entrepreneurial Chinese in cities to create their own private businesses. They too had shown tolerance when farmers began to take charge of the land, deciding what to plant and where to sell it, while at the same time boosting productivity and powering new economic growth. Similarly, when foreign investors were invited to set up factory operations, the business-minded party had provided them with labor. The excess rural workers, freed up as the communes were dismantled, could now travel to the coast and, earning much more in their new jobs as factory hands, build better lives for themselves and their children, thus setting off the biggest human migration in history. It, too, was what I had learned while studying contemporary Chinese history at Stanford University some years earlier. China's transition from an autarkic Maoist state to a country led by new, practical, reform-minded leaders seemed pretty much unquestioned among academics and corporate heads alike. Awful tragedies like the June 4, 1989 massacre raised serious questions about the future of any significant political change, but the course toward an even more open economy seemed certain. Uneven development would be inevitable in the process. As Deng himself had reportedly said, in his version of trickle-down economics, some must get rich first. But opportunities for all able Chinese, including hundreds of millions of farmers and migrants, were part of an implicit bargain. The people would not openly criticize the party or demand political and civil rights. The party would preside over a constantly evolving economic system, one that, above all, would ensure rising material welfare. In the years following my arrival and long after Deng had died, the deal still seemed alive, at least in China's cities. In the fall of 1997, at the 15th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, the leadership formally announced that private business, once banned, henceforth was an important part of the economy, a reflection of its already fast growth, with more and more Chinese making their fortunes outside the confines of the state. In 1999, the reform-minded premier, Zhu Rongji, like Mao, a native of Hunan, but by contrast an advocate of loosening party control, had overseen the difficult market-opening concessions necessary to win entry into the World Trade Organization. China's leaders promised to welcome foreign companies into everything from the automobile and agricultural industries to banking, insurance, and tourism. That liberalization would later bring a flood of money from overseas, creating jobs and opportunities for tens of millions of Chinese. And an aside touted as evidence that the new China was fast becoming a desirable place to do cutting-edge business, by the millennium, an internet boom had seized the country, with then-hot web companies like NetEase.com, Sohu.com, and China.com soaring in value after listing on NASDAQ. People in the know in the country's big cities started using a new initialism, VC, for venture capital. And for the first time since the outmigration of Chinese students overseas had begun in the 1980s, Chinese students educated abroad started to return in large numbers, eager to get in on the action. The new web boom, however, was of limited interest to me, even as news stories about deal-making drew readers. When I decided to study China years earlier, my motivation had been to see how an ancient country with a very different culture from the West had gone through an agrarian revolution before becoming socialist and finally was changing to a market economy. Now working Beijing as a reporter for Businessweek, I wanted to see how the Labaixing, literally old 100 names or regular folks, were faring during the new reforms. As I explained to friends at the time, I hadn't come to China to write about Harvard-educated MBAs, former McKinsey consultants, tapping VC money to fund internet startups in China. That, in fact, completely bored me. I was pleased when I discovered years later that academics writing about rural China used VCs as shorthand for village committees, the lowest level of government in the countryside. So while talk of hot new internet plays gripped Beijing, I headed south in the summer of 2000 to visit two parts of China then still largely untouched by the web craze: Guangdong, home to China's top export manufacturing base, and Guizhou, its least developed and poorest province. The Pearl River Delta, which had won China the sobriquet factory to the world, was already home to millions of migrant workers laboring in thousands of factories, including in Shenzhen, the country's first special economic zone, and just north of it in Dongguan, a rough-and-tumble string of factory towns, each distinguished by an industry, including shoes, toys, furniture, and lamps. Guizhou, meanwhile, had long been a frontier region of China, known for its beautiful plunging green karst mountains, among which lived a startling variety of ethnic minority groups with a history of rebelling against central control. Then, as before, it was known for a dearth of arable land and much poverty, and those conditions meant that most young people left for the coast to find factory or construction work. No 3 days are clear, no 3 feet of land are level, and no one has 3 ounces of silver, an old Guizhou saying put it. My intention was to see how the party's grand bargain was working for the other China, from workers and farmers from lagging interior provinces, not the relatively well-off residents of its showcase coastal cities, where signs of material success were becoming increasingly apparent. Earlier that year, policymakers had launched another major economic policy whose name, the Develop the West Plan, suggested that things were not going as smoothly in the hinterlands. The plan, the brainchild of President Jiang Zemin, the most urban of leaders, he had spent the bulk of his career in Shanghai, aimed to bring economic growth to China's inland provinces, including Guizhou, Guangxi, Sichuan, and Gansu, as well as Tibet, and the sprawling city of Chongqing. Tax breaks and low-interest loans were to lure big Chinese and multinational companies into investing, combined with massive government spending on infrastructure, including roads, rail, and power projects. Officials in Beijing recognized that parts of the country were falling behind as inequality between regions and urban and rural areas widened. Less openly expressed was that the new policy aimed to ensure that migrants, after years laboring in the factories, would eventually go home. That required some minimum level of prosperity in China's interior. At the dawn of the 21st century, the electronics manufacturing town of Chang'an was a top destination for migrants. Indeed, with a population of almost 600,000, it was the country's most populous zheng, or town. With its huge population, China's government is split into 5 levels. The central government in Beijing, provinces, cities, counties, and townships, which sometimes can be home to hundreds of thousands of people, as Chang'an is. Villages, although not officially part of the administrative system, have their own village chief and party secretary. Chang'an, like all the factory towns that together made up Dongguan, was spread along the 107 Guangdong, the national highway that runs north to south across China, from the capital city of Beijing to the border with Hong Kong. Here, on the final stretch, the ugly inner workings of the country's export machine became apparent. For kilometer after kilometer, dust-stained 2-story factories with bars in their windows jostled for space along this artery and led to the massive Yantian port in Shenzhen. Occasionally glimpses of villas could be seen, the homes of Taiwanese and Hong Kong factory owners, hidden behind gray cement walls. Only when a typhoon swept over was Guangdong once again recognizable as a semi-tropical region, the lush green mountains reasserting their presence in the distance, as rain temporarily washed clean the industrial landscape. Ma Mei-chuen was one of 4 migrants here, hailing from the same small village in Guizhou. At 18 years old, she was already in her 2nd year of factory work in 2000. After dropping out of school at 15, making her one of the most educated in her village, she had helped her parents in the rice fields for 2 years before coming to Chang'an in 1998. Still dressed in her blue work smock, worn for the 14-hour shifts she put in every day checking video cassettes and audio cassettes for flaws, Mei-chuen seemed painfully shy. There were no jobs at home, and our land was a very small plot, so I left home to find work, she said, carefully avoiding my gaze as we sat in a restaurant across the street from the Triton Electronics factory. Her pay was only 1 yuan, 12 cents an hour, she explained, staring at a spot on the table. And while a dormitory room was provided, it was sweltering in the summer and bone-chillingly cold in the winter, and she shared it with 14 others. I think it's pitiful. I want to go back and start some small business and never return to Dongguan, said her distant cousin Hua Yukai, 24 years old, a red streak of dye in his hair giving him a stylish flair, who had joined us for dinner. Later I met the other 2 migrants from the same Guizhou village. 32-year-old Mo Wenjie had been the first to come to Chang'an and now worked as a cook in a Taiwanese-owned electronics factory, but fretted about his wife and 5-year-old daughter back in the countryside, whom he got to see only once a year. 25-year-old Mo Rubois, who worked as a welder in the same factory, had an easy confidence about him rare among the migrants, and was determined to stay in Dongguan. Sitting in the dank dormitory room he shared with 10 others, he marveled at how easy it was to buy everything from toothpaste to music cassettes to the many different varieties of food available in the many small shops and restaurants that lined the street outside the factory. In his village, one had to wait for the weekly market. At the foot of the bunk bed Roubois slept in lay 2 barbells he used every evening after his long shifts. On a nearby scuffed small desk was a simple model of a motorcycle. One day he hoped to get a real one, he said. The self-assured Roubois had a pretty girlfriend his age who worked in a nearby factory and came from a farming family in Henan, far north of Guangdong and Guizhou. Later that night he introduced us when I met them on the bustling nearby street, with tiny eateries catering to the migrants from all over China. Having seen where the Mois worked, later in the fall I traveled to the remote hometown of Binghuacun, a village of less than 1,000 people, almost all Buyi ethnic minority in southeast Guizhou. Cun means village. To get there, I took a 3-hour plane flight from Beijing to Guiyang, a 5-hour train ride to a county seat, followed by 2 hours in a bus. There I met a young up-and-coming official named Moi Ruchuan, who came from the village but now worked in a nearby town and who escorted me for the final stretch. That involved more than an hour riding on a horse cart through the mountainous terrain. For Meituan back for a brief stay from Dongguan, the trip had involved a 29-hour train ride. The final approach required crossing the narrow and slippery top of a crumbling concrete dam, water rushing about one's feet, before reaching ramshackle wooden houses clinging to a steep green slope. Narrow cobblestone paths wound through the village, chickens scratching in the rare flat patches of land. Water buffalo lowed and pigs snorted from inside the dark stables that comprised the first floor of each dwelling, with the family's living quarters 1 floor above. Bathrooms were attached outhouses, while cooking was done over wood-burning hearths. The nearest hospital and middle school were hours away. There was no phone service. The bad roads were a big obstacle to our village's development, the 50-some-year-old village party secretary, Moi Wenke, told me gravely, as we sat in the shadows of a darkened room. Electricity was available for only a few hours a day, the orange glow of his burning cigarette casting a pin of light. But that was about to change, with the launch of big new infrastructure projects under the auspices of Develop the West. Officials from the township government that oversaw Binghuacun had assured Wenke and the other villagers. In particular, the muddy horse track was to be paved and made double lane, connecting the village to the nearby township, which in turn would connect it to other yet-to-be-built roads that went to the provincial capital, some 222 kilometers distant. China's expected entry into the World Trade Organization a year-plus later was sure to open up new markets for the village's agricultural products, too, they were told. And the new opportunities, they hoped, would lure back some of the young adults who had left, thus helping Binghuacun avoid becoming a home for only the elderly and children. Already the villagers were planning to stop growing only corn and rice and add more valuable crops like chili peppers, rapeseed, and fruit. And the construction of a small factory to process the new crops would be key to his village's success, the party secretary said. Meituan was a changed person here, far from the factories, her shyness gone, smiling and eager to show me around the village as we went from house to house meeting her relatives. Villagers dressed in muted shades of blue, either in the proletarian canvas outfits common across China since Mao days, or the darker blue homespun cloth traditionally worn by the Buyi, kept coming up to us, curious to see a foreign visitor, but also eager to quiz Meituan about life in the far-off city. How much did she earn in the factory? What did she eat? What were the city people like? They asked, feeling the plush of her new red vest with farm-roughened hands. I would like to study more first if I had enough money, Meituan later told me. Then after the roads are completed, I want to open a business and do something useful for my village. Meituan had come back to help her parents harvest rice for the fall. But an equally important reason was to replace her expired identity card. Otherwise she risked being picked up by the police in Dongguan. Migrants who usually were forced to hand over their IDs to factory managers when they started working were often put into the feared black jails, or arbitrary detention centers, where they were held against their will and sometimes beaten up by police for not carrying identification. A shakedown payment of 100 yuan to their captors, a large sum for most workers, around a week's pay, could win one's freedom. A distant relative of Mei Chuan's had been held in a detention center for 3 months in Guizhou, a nearby city in the Pearl River Delta. Following his release, he had fled home to Binghuacun, abandoning his job in a local toy factory and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?